Now joining us from Paris is the former World Bank advisor and now director of the EU ASEAN Center, Meher Nicolas. Firstly, thank you very much for being here with us on Q News. So how might this sustained inflation in Israel above the government's target affect household purchasing power and the living standards in Israel? If you could give us an idea of what you think.
It's a very complicated issue, so it's a matter of the glass half full, right? So I'm not here to defend the Israeli government, far from it, but I think so far, considering all the pressures that the Israeli economic machinery had to withstand in the past 2 years, is doing quite well. So not amazing, but is doing quite well. It is true that inflation is above target. And it's true that as a consequence, both households, consumers and private sector companies, which rely on borrowing when the interest rate is high and inflation is above target, it's not great for them, but it's nothing dramatic. So it's nothing dramatic. Here, the main metric is GDP growth. All of Israel's enemies were looking at a collapse of the GDP growth because of the long sustained war. I mean, the problem is that, Israel's army is not a professional army in the sort of French, British sense. It's more of a Swiss type army, which relies a lot on the conscription, on the constant conscription of civilians. And when they are conscribed into the army as the war drags on, they leave the factory, they leave the office, and it's bad for GDP growth, right? Because it's not a professional army, it's a citizen army. That's the way the country is built. So to make a long story short, the biggest thing we have to look at now is GDP growth. According to the latest estimates, growth came down from 3% or 3.2%, which was expected a year or a year and a half ago, to 2% or 1.9% today, right? That's the annualized expected growth for this year. Now you could say, oh my God, it went from 3.2% to 1.8, 1.9. Oh my God, it's a 50% decline, right? That's the glass half empty. But the glass half full is, considering the war, etc., it's not bad. Let's look at, countries like Israel, like France, for example, or most Western European countries. Today, they're growing at 0.5, 0.6% per annum. So at 2%, in terms of real GDP growth, Israel is doing quite well.
Okay.
Another metric which I think is interesting, of course, because of government deficit, there's a sizable 6-7% budget deficit, which is bad. It's really non-sustainable. It's a direct consequence of military spending. Okay, it's bad. But if you look at the flip side of the coin, the consequence of that Israeli government budget deficit, what is it? It's borrowing. So Israel has to borrow more money. It's not good. But let's look at the debt, the government debt to GDP ratio. It went from 60% before the start of the war to 67, 68% now. So it's bad. Yes, it's not great. But right now, countries like Italy, France, or even the US, they have a debt to GDP ratio of 110 or 120%. So here again, Israel is not stellar or amazing, but it's doing quite well. So to make a long story short, what I'm coming at is the situation is not bad. Not bad. You mentioned Eilat. You mentioned Eilat earlier. That's a symbolic blow to the Israeli economy. Eilat, to be honest, is not a rich city. It's the third largest Israeli port, far behind Haifa and Ashdod.
So but it still might have quite an effect on supply chains, though, would you say, and increased costs for businesses and perhaps consumers?
Yes, I mean, I think, Eilat roughly, it's 15 or whatever, 14% of the Israeli supply chain coming from seabound containers, right? So if you take the whole Israeli supply chain, including, roads and airports, Eilat's influence or size falls down to 7 or 8%. It's not great. It's not good, clearly, but it's not horrible, because all the action now is around Haifa and Ashdod. And what's interesting, in that new American-Chinese Cold War, which is now the main sort of geo-economic issue of our time, what's interesting is in Haifa, for example, the biggest port, you have Chinese and Indian private and government-controlled companies rushing to expand the Haifa port, spending billions of dollars in Israel, and the money is coming from India and China. That's interesting because it's a vote of confidence in Israel. And one last thing I want to mention, I'm aware of time. To me personally, what's interesting is now NVIDIA, right? So in the past 12 months, literally in the past year, NVIDIA went from being the world's 15th or 20th largest company to now being the world's biggest company. So it's amazing what happened to the market cap of NVIDIA in the past 11, 12 months. And of course, behind it, you have the AI tech revolution. So NVIDIA, an American, Taiwanese, American company, let's say from California or Oregon, is now the world's biggest capitalist industrial player by a big margin.
Okay.
And what's interesting is...
Go on. No, go ahead then. Go ahead.
Is NVIDIA announced recently at the beginning of the year, they were expanding their presence in Israel. And last week, they announced again that they were like quadrupling or quintupling the size of their presence in Israel. And they're going to build in the coming quarters in the north of Israel, in Galilee, a multi-trillion-dollar AI, R&D, and production, microchip production facility. That's also an amazing vote of confidence considering the war.
Yes, well, you were saying that obviously Israel is not doing too badly, and certainly not running out of money to keep sending missiles into its neighbors, whether it be Syria, Lebanon, Iran, or of course what's happening in Gaza. But will defense spending eventually have an effect and affect Israel's fiscal balance or the amount of money that it could spend on public sector resources?
So here the answer is probably yes, if the war drags much longer. And here the problem, once again, is not spending, because Israel, having a relatively low national debt, government debt to GDP ratio, Israel can afford a very long war by borrowing more, and they can even afford to have an abnormally high budget deficit, right? They can bite the bullet. The problem here is conscription, because once again, like Switzerland or Singapore, it's a citizens' army. So by removing away from the workforce engineers, technicians, CEOs, CFOs, traders, you name it, in the long run, it's not good for the economy. And in the long run, it could destabilize the Israeli economy by removing too many people away from the private sector workforce. So I think that is the issue I am concerned about. And I think that's why there is pressure now on Netanyahu's government, even from the so-called right-wing capitalist Likud backers, even from the people who like him. There is pressure on him to wrap up and close the war.
So basically, the business sector have their workforce taken away as conscripts for the army,
Yes.
And they're going to start putting pressure on the government to get this war over, so they can have their staff back. Is that basically what do you think?
Absolutely right, and that's the price to pay when you are, by design, a citizens' army, which was how Israel was built since inception, since 1948, just like the Swiss and the Singaporeans. If you have a British or French model where it's a professional army and you go to war, you don't have that kind of problem.